Hi, welcome. This is George Saab, the Vice President of Java at Oracle and the Chair of the OpenJDK Governing Board. And I'm pleased to be here today with Greg Williams from Wired Magazine for a chat about Java and where it's headed in the context of an ever-shifting industry. So how's it going today, Greg?
Good, really good. Good to be here and excited about the conversation.
Excellent. Maybe you want to give us a little bit more of an intro of your background and what you're interested in there at Wired.
Sure. I'm really interested in, I guess, the way that technology is shaping the world. I mean, I guess there's a lot of people that are interested in tech for tech's sake, and they're interested in the kind of like the more technical side, and really are kind of very inspired by developing, if you like. My sort of interest really is like actually what's the impact of this in the real world. So whether that is around healthcare or whether that's around security, behavioral change within consumers. That's the part that I'm kind of really focused on. So, what's the impact of tech? How do we solve some of the biggest challenges we face around tech, whether that's climate heating or whether that's sort of inequality. So those kinds of challenges are the ones that are on my mind.
Excellent, thanks. Well, certainly one of the things that we're interested in is making sure that Java is a technology that's continuing to evolve and meet people's needs for solving real business problems. I guess one of the interesting things in this context, is as similar to what you said, we're not really interested in technology for technology's sake. It's more technology in service of trying to solve real business problems. So I guess I'm kind of curious. What are some of the sort of transformational trends that you see going on that you think are going to be important as we're going forward?
Just a small question then, George.
Exactly.
So I guess the way to think about it is like, before sort of 2020, I guess the way that most organizations were planning for the future was to look at the world in a linear way. So they could figure out their progress and their future by projecting using the models of the past. And clearly, COVID upended many of those assumptions and expectations about the way that we grow and we manage our businesses and our understanding of our customers. I also think that there's many other things, including some emerging technologies that really haven't changed, right? So I think that and I'm sure you're seeing it in your world, George, but I think one of the interesting trends is like convergence of technologies. So like none of the technologies on which the kind of the organizational changes and platforms of the future are going to be made are really happening in a vacuum. So one thing I think that the last couple of years has made us really aware of is these kind of complex ecosystems are really highly interdependent, and that we live in this really interdisciplinary world where we're thinking about drug discovery. So machine learning was a very big part of that.
Yeah.
We're thinking about the way that I don't know, currency and finance is changing. Clearly, blockchain is having an impact on that. Synthetic biology, robotics, additive manufacturing, material science, all these accelerating technologies are kind of coming together in new and interesting ways and impacting each other in kind of new consumer and industrial applications that are really going to have an interesting impact on, I think, business, society, and geopolitics. So it really doesn't matter, where people are working, whether it's in retail or shipping, pharma, consultancy, it doesn't matter. I think that tech really is beginning to change the idea of business as usual. And it offers, obviously, there's threats, but it also offers huge opportunity. So I guess what I would say is like how we think about the future is not really about technology. It's like how human ingenuity, how collaboration, how creativity will fundamentally challenge some of the assumptions that we have about business as usual and how we embrace change.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really interesting. When we're thinking about evolution of Java, one of the things that has always been kind of interesting is, how do you balance the needs that people have for things to remain stable, for them to remain compatible, for them to just be rock solid, with, on the other hand, this need for innovation, a desire to be able to do new things, to tackle new problems, to handle new environments and situations. And so, that's something we've done a lot of thinking about. And, obviously, Java is in a fantastic position today, super popular, most popular programming language and platform really in the industry and driving, much of the world's computing. But at the same time, we're cognizant of the fact that we're in an industry that's ever changing. We're in a world that's ever changing. And so we don't want to be resting on our laurels. We want to be thinking of, what can we do in order to make sure that, things people are trying to tackle today and tomorrow, that Java is going to be there and ready for them when they need it. And so, it's a hard problem to kind of do both of those. It's one of the reasons why in our industry you sometimes just see new technologies coming along that basically don't have a lot of baggage to kind of keep up. They basically are just looking at the new thing. On the other hand, sometimes they get to a point where they're great at that one niche new thing, but they haven't actually figured out how to make the transition into a technology that's going to be sustainable and long lasting. So, for us, that's been the interesting balancing act. And the main shift that we made was one from in the past where we did these releases every, few years that were very focused on a new, feature or set of features, but we're not very predictable in how we could get them out. And instead, we've moved to a model where every 6 months we have a new release. And we have this sort of arc of features that we're working on, looking at particular themes or areas where we think the technology needs to be improving and getting that incrementally into the hands of developers more rapidly. While at the same time continuing to offer security, stability, and performance releases in a long-term support format so that the enterprises that have something working that just has to keep working and have that heartbeat are able to do that and transition that to newer versions at their leisure when it works for them. Um, so interesting here. I'm kind of interested in some of these particular spaces. Are there, particular things in, artificial intelligence, fintech, cybersecurity, healthcare, robotics, space? Like, which of these things do you think are most likely to be kind of, driving the direction of our industry going forward?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. And I think really when you think about the opportunity maybe for technology moving forward, the biggest opportunity for me is going to be the switch from a carbon-based economy to one largely based on sustainables, whether that's electricity or whatever. Because this is going to be the biggest economic shift we have ever had, even bigger than when we moved from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. So I think we're going to be seeing all kinds of super interesting changes going on there. I was in San Francisco last week and met with a bunch of startups, and we're already seeing sort of like so many interesting use cases and the way that machine learning is being used in order to understand, for instance, the outputs across the supply chain for various organizations. So that's, I think, a really interesting space where we're going to see sort of enormous amounts of innovation. I think that what's going on at the moment, we're going to be seeing a lot of geopolitical trends that are driving us into sort of like a more fragmented world when it comes to standards and governance of the internet, and that's going to be a really interesting process because there's more EU legislation coming. There's going to be legislation in the US as well. So we're beginning to see sort of like this world where people are talking about this idea of the so-called splinternet, right, where there are different spheres of influence and different kind of systems of governance. I think one interesting area is the rise of new interfaces. People, as I'm sure, keep talking to you, George, about the rise of the metaverse and how this is going to change everything. I'm not entirely sure we've seen particularly convincing sort of use cases of this thus far. I've seen some in healthcare, which I'm sure you have, and in other industries. But I think the way I would think about the metaverse isn't almost like a video game, which is I think how most people are imagining it, but as like an extension of our world. So the extension of the physical world into the virtual world, and what are the problems that we can solve when we suddenly move into those kinds of environment. I think there's a real opportunity there. Clearly, the rise in automation in manufacturing and other industries, service-based manufacturing, so much, so many things going on under the hood now that are really sort of like these very, very clever applications of machine learning in back office tools. I think that we're going to be seeing, as I mentioned earlier, this sort of shift from we think about this shift from the agricultural to the industrial economy back in the 19th century. I do think that robotics and automation are going to be having a similar impact. We think about, autonomous vehicles. I had my first ride in an autonomous vehicle last week in San Francisco, and I got to the place where I was having it by using a ride share, right? So this is a world where both of the people who took me to this autonomous vehicle could potentially not be in that industry any longer. But although I do think we're going to see some really interesting new jobs come out of this whole process of transition. So I think I talked about sustainability and the move towards climate tech. I think we're seeing really interesting startups in the areas of like plant-based sources of protein. Clearly, you mentioned security earlier on in terms of Java. Clearly, the importance of cybersecurity is absolutely crucial now. All organizations need to think about security, and that shouldn't just be the job of the CIO. That's everyone throughout the org. We're seeing the rise, obviously, of blockchain-based products and services, new forms of interface, which I think is really interesting, based on sort of like our voice and vision. And then there's obviously the really interesting areas around synthetic biology, quantum computing. All these are accelerating. So we're clearly going to see impact across a wide variety of industries, George, which makes me kind of curious to ask you, which industries is Java a predominant player in?
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you ask. There was a VDC study recently which covered, some of the industries that Java is either at the top of or near the top of, and I think it's an incredible number. It's something like 23 industries, where Java is represented as, in either the top technology or one of the top two or three. So we see it, from finance to healthcare to telecommunications to medicine. We see it in evolving technologies as well. Some of the things that you talked about were not really industry areas, but they're more sort of capabilities, right? As you brought out, machine learning is not, it used to be a thing in itself. Now it's not. It's a technology that can be used and brought across all of these industries in ways that people are increasingly understanding. And in fact, the way that we think about this for something like Java, which really is a very general purpose platform, is that we're kind of not in the business of making necessarily the high level, single library that will be used by everyone for machine learning. Rather, what we're trying to do, and that's just one example area, what we're trying to do instead is create a platform that is the ideal platform for anyone who wants to make a machine learning library, right? And so it's sort of far broader and more applicable than, in just providing a point solution, which might be great for a niche, but actually doesn't make it as generally useful. And so the hard part there, and actually I'm really interested in your thoughts on this, is what we tend to do then is work back from these areas. So whether it be the particular industries, whether it be the technologies powering the industry or the sort of capabilities that people want in a library or a framework, to what are the capabilities that the underlying computing platform like Java needs to provide. So, I'll give you an example. Machine learning tends to be driven by being able to represent amazingly large amounts of data and being able to reason over that data in a very performant way, and being able to provide the answer to queries on that reasoning with extremely low latency response time.
Yeah.
So what are there particular capabilities like that you think these trends that you're seeing in the industry drive or are going to require?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess probably I should sort of maybe just touch on the kind of the challenges and the opportunities in these sectors for innovation. And I think really what's interesting to me is there are three kind of core areas, right? So I think that technology is going to continue. Look, we all know technology enables scale in a way that was previously impossible, right? So I do think that we're going to see this acceleration in terms of adoption, this acceleration in terms of reach. So the example that I think is really just worth citing is that electricity and telephones took around 30 years each to reach three-quarters of Americans, and smartphones took 8 years. 4 billion people around the world now carry these kind of very powerful computers in their bags and pockets. Look at a platform like TikTok, which anyone watching who's got kids, their kids are definitely on it. Launched in September 2016. By the end of 2020, it had 1.9 billion users. So this whole idea of scale and the way that we can reach, if you develop a great product, you can reach users in ways that was never possible. And we probably know this about software companies, but we're beginning to sort of see this in the material world. So I think a company like Lime, the e-scooter company, founded in January 2017, it took 6 months to hit 1 million users, and then 10 months later it had reached 10 million. So suddenly you can reach these huge marketplaces. Photovoltaic cells between 1975 and a couple of years ago, they dropped in price some 500 times. The cost of generating electricity from large-scale solar power and wind has dropped below the very, very cheapest fossil fuels now. So in the decade to 2019, the price of electricity has declined 89%. So we're seeing these really interesting changes driven by technology platforms into the material world. And I think we're going to increasingly see this in areas like biology. So, we can think about the way that biology might inform and might change the manufacturing of physical products. So perhaps we can, use technology to sequence, to manipulate microorganisms and turn them into these little factories that produce chemicals and materials we need. There was a piece of research, one study I read recently, that suggests that around 60% of all the physical inputs to the global economy could be produced biologically by 2040. So that's a huge shift. The other big shift I think that we're seeing, and this really is also like dependent on development of very powerful algorithms, is that we've created a kind of like a kind of a winner takes all sort of like dominant marketplace. So if you look at the sort of like the market share of some of the large technology companies, it's up there in the 80-90% range, which is super interesting. Ride shares similar. Advertising similar. So we have seen the rise of these superstar dominant companies that rises really rapidly above others. Formerly in economic models, you could never really get much, even if you had a pretty sort of like strong product, you can really very, very hard for you to get much above 30% market share. But technology sort of changes all that. Obviously, rapidly declining costs is a factor. But there is a positive feedback loop clearly that turns market leaders into these kind of perpetual motion machines. So, as you well know, the power of network effects. The larger the number of users, the better the product becomes, and the better the product becomes, the more users it attracts. And that means that so often second place can be quite a long way behind. So, with that in mind, I'm interested, maybe to get your thoughts, George, around where Java plays best, like in this kind of whole modernization process, or in legacy applications, or new design in the cloud. Like, where do you think its role really is in those areas?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly something that we think about a lot. Obviously, Java has a very large presence in many legacy applications, things that have been out there for years and years and years. And we are seeing a very healthy transition that people are making as they're taking those applications and moving them into the cloud. Java is not talked about as much in that scenario. Mostly, I think, because it's so unsurprising how popular it is, right? You don't get a lot of clicks writing articles about people succeeding with Java, running their business, or even transitioning, Java into the cloud, because of course it works. When we're thinking about evolution of Java, one of the areas that we've been thinking about a lot is, looking at things that we can do to make it so that younger, less experienced programmers come along and find it more approachable. I think that, part of Java's popularity of, about 15, 20 years ago was that it gave people fairly structured ways of doing things. It was fairly verbose and therefore easy to maintain and read code that people had written. But, it may not have been the easiest thing to pick up and get started with. And so that's something we've been working on a lot, having things like a read eval print loop in something called JShell, that allows a programmer to come along, start to type, have autocomplete, see things happen immediately, right? We've done that not only in a way that only works with our tool, but basically provided as an API that interactive development environments can use so that anyone across the industry can interface with this. In addition, we've looked at places where the sort of boilerplate or ceremony around Java programs can be reduced and made easier for people to get started. We've also done things like included more tools out of the box, like in Java 18, we included a simple HTTP web server that any novice programmer coming along can just spin that up and be able to actually have a fairly sophisticated cloud-based model of running things. Now, in addition to sort of those tools that are just in the JDK, Oracle, of course, has a wide range of tools that we provide to our subscription customers, including something called the Java Management Service. This is a Oracle Cloud Native service that allows people to monitor and manage all the instances of Java they may be running, across on-premise, in Oracle Cloud, and in other clouds as well. And this is something that, to your point about security, stability, performance, it's all about knowing what you're actually running. What is the estate of Java that they're running? What version is it on? Is it all secure? What things are coming in the future that I might need to know about and be prepared for? So I think those are some of the main things we've been thinking of there. I think one final thing I would mention is we've been looking at styles of programming, programming models that people want to embrace. So Java started out as very object oriented. And what we've managed to do, I think, quite nicely is add the ability to have a functional style of programming in Java in a way that feels extremely natural. And this started out with introducing Lambda functions in Java 8. And as we've moved forward, doing things like embracing immutable data in records and sealed objects, as well as pattern matching. Again, all of this providing a great foundation for things like machine learning, making it even more applicable to a lot of those industries we were talking about. But in a way that's not just about a one-time I'm going to try it and throw it away. Rather, it's something that can be put into an operational model that continues to run as you're going forward.
Super interesting. Yeah, I mean, just in terms of those sort of like, opportunities for innovation, and I think that we're having to really examine the future of work as well, right? The way that we work as teams, the way that we work with our customers, the way that we work with, our partners. And I think what's interesting to me is that technology changes the way that we access all kinds of things, right? So commodities, the way that we manufacture products, the way that we increasingly generate, energy. And what's interesting to me is that there's kind of like going to be a new shift, I believe, to producing all three of these in our own regions. But at the same time, the complexity of these economies is going to make sort of cities more important. So we're creating a tension between regional and sort of like central, central government to an extent. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we're looking at a relocalization in some areas of our economy, and we're going to see this impact in multiple ways. So best example is, I think, additive manufacturing, which is like an area that I know a lot of developers are working in. And it's going to further increase the value of IP and a new sort of like trend of ship the design, not the product, right? So we will not be moving atoms around the world. We won't be moving sneakers and plates or mugs around the world. We will be moving the designs around the world, and they'll be printed out in local areas. And I think this has only been heightened by what we've experienced in the last couple of days. Last couple of years. And this all goes back to this whole kind of remote work and the future of work kind of idea, right? we are not reversing this trend. People are going to be distributed, in various places. They're going to be working asynchronously. And I think we've discovered that people can be effective without commutes, and that there are many companies that are rethinking, about thinking about their approach to this and how they can find talent from all over the world. All kinds of tech companies now I speak to they're completely redesigning their offices and making them more like kind of members clubs with meeting rooms, coffee areas, great places to interact, not as kind of like somewhere where necessarily certain types of work gets done, but where people go to really have that kind of intellectual stimulation through social interaction. So that's a super interesting idea. And I mentioned the metaverse earlier on, and as we begin to see this kind of slow emergence of the hardware and indeed the software that is going to signal this kind of like change in, this shift into a virtual world, I think this is only going to increase. So I'm interested to get your sense, working with so many kind of people and such a vast community about the future of work as well, and also, how you think that what the challenges are really for innovation in an accelerating culture.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really interesting topic, and clearly something I've thought about over the last couple of years. Had a lot of people asking me early on, how things with things being closed down were affecting kind of the ongoing development of Java and the Java ecosystem. So, taking the first part first, interestingly, you know, my team at Oracle is already extended, all the way around the world. And so we've basically always been doing most of our development remotely. In addition, we do most of our stewardship of technology evolution in the OpenJDK community, right? So it's mostly projects led by Oracle for Java evolution, but with people taking part and contributing from a wealth of different companies, organizations, individuals in all kinds of countries. And so, I would have to say that, you know, without planning it that way, we happen to be fairly well situated for the situation that we all found ourselves in. And I think coupling that with this, 6-month cadence that was time based rather than feature based, these two things worked really well together to make it so that we could pretty much continue to deliver as we were planning to going on. We already had all of the communications facilities that we needed in place. We had all of the development facilities that we needed in place, and so we basically just carried on. Now, how that transitioned into the Java ecosystem as a whole, and as you point out, the Java ecosystem is massive, right? There is someone has said that 2/3 of developers out there have Java experience. There's something like 56 billion active JVMs in 2020, with a prediction of 82 billion in 2025. That was another one of those numbers from BDC. And there are thousands of Java user groups around the world. Now, those user groups kind of evolved at a time when people's modus was going to a meetup, right? A local thing, having some pizza, having somebody come in and give a talk. And I think what we saw quite quickly was a lot of those activities evolving into virtual talks, a lot of the conferences where people would typically go and meet and learn about new technology, moving virtual. And now as things have been opening up again, we've seen those move to hybrid environments, and even to in-person environments again. And I think that from what I've seen there, I think that this industry and developers in particular, have been open to using these technologies and embracing them. And as we said, many of the things that we've used, sort of tools for development, have already gotten to a point where if I'm doing my development in the cloud, it doesn't necessarily matter whether I'm interacting with that environment from my office, or from my home, or from a train in between. And so I think that's
Yeah.
been very, very helpful. But I am welcoming getting back to having the facility for meeting people in person, because I think, like so many problems, in our industry and elsewhere, many of our biggest challenges are not technology challenges; they're people challenges, right? And
Yeah.
so being able to marry these two, of having the technology that we're able to work on in a distributed fashion, but being able to get people together so that we can discuss and learn and grow, is really kind of the best of both worlds. So looking forward to that.
Yeah. 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 You can't beat those serendipitous moments, I don't think.
Yeah, good. So I think it's about time for us to wind up here. Any last thoughts?
I guess what's interesting to me is the fact that, like, we are in many ways, in this conversation, what we kind of I think we've got to is that, if you think back to sort of like the early days of the web, like the whole idea of the web, I guess, was that, I remember, Tim Berners-Lee sort of like saying, look, this is for everyone. And I think that a lot of the sort of challenges that we face at the moment need sort of like a wide community of people contributing them in order to find the best outcomes. So I'm sort of like, I'm really interested to sort of like, see how communities come together and build products and develop tools to really sort of figure out best practice, and also to sort of like solve sort of like some of the biggest challenges we face. So I'm gonna ask you now, George. Apologies, I feel like I'm putting you on the spot a little bit. Is there any kind of like, any sort of sense from you of like, when you look back in the history of technology, any kind of moment that sort of stands out to you as an exemplar of how we might kind of look forward?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think many of my colleagues have also reflected on this, that the longer we're in this industry, the more we feel like we see the same solutions again and again. And so there's this temptation to sort of look at something and say, yeah, that was solved in the 70s, that was solved in the 90s. But of course, the world is moving on. And so the situations in which those technologies are brought to bear is evolving and is different. And I think Java is no exception to this. When Java came out, there weren't necessarily a bunch of things in it that were so revolutionary. What was revolutionary was more the combination and the way that it was brought with the philosophy of being a blue collar language, right? Not being some kind of Ivy Tower language, and being made into something that was not a proprietary playground for one vendor, but was technology that an entire industry could embrace. And this is something that we've thought of as we're thinking of evolution going forward: is how do we stay true to those ideals, right? How do we stay true to that philosophy, but at the same time realize that the situation we're in today, the use cases we're in today, the problems that our customers face are ever evolving, and we need to evolve with them and make sure that we're enabling them.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Things are ever evolving, and we need to sort of figure out ways of solving those challenges with a broad-based community of people. So, well, thank you for the conversation, George. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate it. Good to talk with you again, and take care.
Take care. Be safe.